Hey guys, welcome to episode number 3 of HP Boost. Today I'm going to be talking about the definition of eSports. I had mentioned in the last episode I would elaborate on the nature of the sport and why it's important for us to understand it. I believe the definition is crucial in how we should seek to approach health more holistically, but more specifically on our approach for injury management in eSports. So moving on, what is an eSport? An eSport is a static endurance sport which tests our executive functions through a virtual environment. So I know that's a mouthful, but let's elaborate a little further on each of these parts so those who look in from the outside can better understand our community, but also for those like myself who are part of a support staff aiming to improve the performance and health of their athletes. This way we can be a little more effective in how we impact the various aspects of player management. Static versus dynamic. This is the first part of the definition, and when we compare esports to traditional sports, we can see that esports is much more static, which means little to no movement or just very small ranges of motion for our joints. So thinking about that a little further, we're just moving our mouse, pressing some buttons with our thumbs and the small joints of our hands, wrists, and fingers. Yes, absolutely, sometimes we do use our shoulder, but that's very different and much less dynamic, which is something more characteristic of traditional sports. So a lot of moving bodies at high velocities and power, and with the body moving through more extensive and wide ranges of motion. So again, we're just sitting and have quite limited overall movement in our bodies. This of course is not considering virtual reality, which is absolutely going to change the game if and when it becomes more accessible or popular, and also when it develops a competitive scene. And I'd probably call that an immersed esport, but hey, that's later on, right? The next part of the definition describes esport as an endurance sport, and this is based on a better understanding of its physical demands. So if we analyze the type and distribution of movements we perform while sitting, we can clearly see that esport is not a power-based or explosive sport like basketball, volleyball, or football, but it resembles more closely a sport like running, which is more cyclical and endurance-based. So looking at the exact movements, it is cyclical repeated movements over an extended period of time for which our bodies need to be conditioned in order to prevent injury. And when I say conditioned, that just means that the physical skill of muscular endurance or stamina is of higher value than just pure strength. So this understanding should dictate how we as support staff can really design wellness programs for our gamers. The last part of the definition goes over the functions being challenged. Traditional sports have a physical game at its foundation, whereas esports has a virtual game at its foundation. And that's not to say that the repeated movements of your shoulder, wrist, and fingers aren't physical. As a result of this, traditional sports are more a test of physical capacity, while esports are primarily a test of cognitive capacity, or what we refer to as executive functions. These are cognitive processes, which include things like reasoning, problem solving, attentional and inhibitory control, working memory, and cognitive flexibility, all of which are necessary to select and monitor different behaviors and help us achieve our goals. So now that we understand what esports is and all the components of its definition, what does that mean in terms of injuries? I want to offer my thoughts as a physical therapist. Because esports are a static and a pattern of repeated movements, classifying it as an endurance sport, we can better understand how to also classify and treat the injuries. Again, traditional sports are more dynamic, which means it's more unpredictable, especially in team sports in which there are a lot of moving bodies with these high velocities of movement as we described earlier. This means there's higher risk of injury as well as less predictability in the type of injuries. So more traumatic injuries can occur in addition to the sprains and strains. With esports, the injuries are way more predictable. It's essentially what many of us do all day hunched over in front of a desk at work. but to the extreme extent. The APMs are much higher for a professional or a competitive gamer compared to the sedentary work job. And that is aside from the game title. Anyways, we can elaborate a little further about the predictability of esports. We have to understand just the physical stress theory, which states our bodies will either adapt to or break down to any stress that is applied to it over time. So we play in these extended positions in which we use the mouse and keyboard, and we utilize these same muscles and tendons over and over. And if we don't allow it enough rest, it will start to break down. So in a game in which there is a high amount of clicking or a lot of button pressing, usually in MOBAs or real-time strategies or things like Smash, or games rather like Smash, you're going to be lifting your index finger or using your thumb excessively, and that's primarily controlled by one or two muscles that we can totally expect to be strained if we use it consistently over time, again without rest. And this is something I've already seen with players whom I've had the chance to work with. The bottom line with all this is that while esports is complicated virtually, it's quite simple physically. We can do very easy things to prevent what are predictable injuries, and also prevent retiring or not being able to participate in competition a reality. So tune in next time when I release HP Boost number 4. But also don't forget to subscribe or check out my website if you want to learn a little more about myself, what I'm doing, or just message me. Anything. But thanks again. I'll see you guys soon.